And now it's time for another Board Game Brawl Top 10 with Nick Meanahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com. Hey peoples, it is time once again for a top 10 list, and once again, it is my top 10 deck building games. I do this list every year. I'm a little late this year, so I do apologize for that. A very kind fan, dedicated fan, pointed that out to me recently. But I do love doing the top 10 deck building games list because it's just a personal favorite genre of mine. Before I go any further, if you don't want to hear any of the rest of my intro, then please click on the timestamp at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a mobile device, it'll be down in the comments section, and you can skip straight to the list. You don't have to hear me ramble. Thank you. So, for the rest of you who are still here, bless you. Blessed are the time wasters. I don't know where I'm going with that. But no, I love my top 10 deck building games list because deck building is one of the coolest game mechanisms, according to me, the best game mechanism that's out there. It feeds my urge to play a card game, which is my favorite components to use. But at the same time, it's engine building, it's deck building without having to go through the rigmarole of collecting cards like in a Magic the Gathering type deck building, or even a living card game type deck building where you still have to buy a lot of stuff and take the time to put it together ahead of time. In a deck building game, you do that at the table. It may not be as fulfilling in the long run, but you have the satisfaction of building up and seeing your plan come to fruition as you put more and more good cards that are based on your preferences into your deck. And I suppose I should give a precursor for people who don't know what deck building games are, but most of you probably do. Everyone starts off with the same inferior deck of cards. You use those cards to buy better cards. They go into your discard pile. Whenever your deck runs out, you reshuffle your discard pile and draw again. And there, eventually, you will have your better cards to use to buy even better cards, or whatever it might be, because there's tons of different deck building games now, and they all do something a little bit different. You have your traditional deck builders like Dominion, which was the grandfather of all deck building games, which is just buy cards, to buy better cards, to buy victory point cards, and whoever has the most is the winner. But then there's games that, one that came out recently called Clank, where you're actually using your cards to go down through a dungeon and grab treasure and run out before the other players can and get as many points as possible. And there's a dragon attacking, but at the same time, you're still doing deck building. It's still the same core mechanism. So that, what I predicted a long time ago, is coming to fruition. Deck building is becoming not just deck building in and of itself in a game, it's becoming a part of a bigger game as a whole. The most notorious example of that, one that's actually been out for a while, was sort of a front runner of this, was Mage Knight, which got re-implemented as Star Trek Frontiers. Mage Knight, the board game, I should specify. There's a Mage Knight miniatures game that's unrelated. But those deck building, when you look at the grand spectacle of the game, feels like a minor thing, even though it's super important. But there's so much going on in the game, and I think that's the future of deck building, and the future is here. Which is a terrible thing and very lame to say. But anyways, that's how I feel about deck building. That's why I do the list every year. You're not going to see, there's some surprises on this list, and there's some things that maybe aren't on the list anymore, and you'll see. We'll go over all of that at the very end of this list. After I get done giving my number one, we'll actually go back and look at last year and see what changed, what's no longer here, and so on and so forth. But, excuse me. But, without further ado, here is my top 10 deck building games for 2016. My number 10 is a new addition to the list, Tyrants of the Underdark. Now, first and foremost, you tell me fantasy game, I'm mildly interested. There's a lot of fantasy games out there, not all of them are that good. But then you tell me it's directly based off of Dungeons & Dragons, specifically the Forgotten Realms segment of the Dungeons & Dragons multiverse. Now I'm more interested, and I have played some games from that universe that are pretty good. And then you tell me it's deck building and area control, which is also a somewhat favorite game mechanism of mine. And now I'm like, okay, tell me more, let me see this thing. And when I finally got to play it, sure enough, it lived up to most of my expectations. You can watch my review of it. There were some things I don't like. It's a very vicious game at times. But ultimately, the theming is great. I thought it looked great. Other people disagree with me, but I thought it looked pretty decent. And I just love the way the deck building is implemented, where you're buying cards in a traditional, I would say, Ascension-style deck building fashion, where there's a randomized row, and there's also static cards that you can always purchase. But you're using those cards to do that area control, to put out troops, to put out spies, to use the different special abilities together with the cards that you have that can affect, based on how you have your troops placed out there. So if you have a spy in this location, you might be able to play a card specifically affecting that location now. Really love how that all came together with the great theme of the Dark Elves. I suppose I should have said this first, but it's the Dark Elves down in the Underdark of the Forgotten Realms universe. And so houses in cities like Menzoberranzan and houses like, I'm sure I'll pronounce them wrong, but Bainray or Bainer, I never... Bainer, I think, was the house speaker, actually. But Bainray. But anyways, I love the theme, and I love deck building, and I love how it all came together in this game. That is Tyrants of the Underdark, my number 10 deck building game for 2016. My number 9, I'm still holding a flame for this game. I may be the only one at this point, but I actually got to play it a couple times in this past year to rekindle my passion for this game. That is Warmachine or Hordes High Command from Privateer Press. This game is, I think, pretty much abandoned at this point. They actually put out a pretty decent amount of expansions for it. I was not happy with how the expansions came out. There was one big box expansion, and of course the Hordes and Warmachine sets came in their own standalone games, and they could all theoretically be mixed together, and there was a ton of small pack expansions that were really annoying. But all of that aside, I just thought this was another great idea of taking traditional deck building, but really just using it in unique ways, where you have your own set of cards that you're buying from, your own personal, it's like you build your deck, but then you have a deck of buy cards that are only for you to build up your troops based on the different factions in the Warmachine and Hordes miniatures game universes, which is like steampunk magic type of thing for the most part. And so I love how that works. Then you're battling over different locations, which can be a little bit clunky, but again, the idea is sound. What's also really neat is that you can commit your troops to take over a location, which again are going to be, you have the sharding cards, but then you're going to be buying better troops. But if you commit your really good troops to taking over that location, they're gone forever. They go into your victory pile as well. But they're also points, so you're not losing anything. It's just a great back and forth, give and take, tons of variety, tons of factions, lots of cool stuff going on. I still recommend it, and unfortunately you could probably get it really cheap now. Well, I mean, fortunately for you, but that means the games probably didn't do all that well in the long run. But I think it had its moment. I think it came and went, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe it still will be supported, I don't know. But for me, I love it. That is Warmachine and Hordes High Command from Privateer Press, my number 9. My number 8 dipped pretty dramatically. I think this was in the top 3 last year. That is Thunderstone Advance from AEG. I don't think anyone even recalls that there was an original Thunderstone at this point. And sadly, Thunderstone Advance even is out of print. I don't know why exactly. I don't really have any knowledge of the numbers of the financial numbers of any of these companies, and most of them don't even make them public anyways. It has to be like a who you know type of thing, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But I'm supposing it didn't do very well, which is shocking, really. I thought that was a flagship title for AEG, but they seem to have moved on to other things. There's rumors that another version of Thunderstone is coming out. I'm like, seriously? But for those of you who are lucky to get Thunderstone Advance, you should probably just stop there. And it's a fantastic game. This is one of the very first games to come out that was very popular in the wake of Dominion years ago, the original Thunderstone. And then it got revamped with Advance, and no one looked back. But it's a fantasy-themed game where you're going down through a dungeon. I mentioned a game called Clank earlier, but this is a bit different. It actually encompasses what it takes to be an adventurer in like an RPG. You go to town, you purchase supplies, you buy weapons, armor, spells, just general goods and supplies. You recruit heroes and can even level them up by buying their more advanced versions. And then hopefully eventually you're going to go into the dungeon, which involves actually fighting monsters on the monster track, which are constantly pouring out and getting worse and worse and worse until eventually the Thunderstone Bearer, the boss, you have to fight them. And it's still just you getting points, so it's actually more like a traditional deck building game in that sense, but there's so much cool theming going on around it, decent artwork, and just a good presentation. There's Epic Thunderstone, which is you throw everything all together. I've played it like that a few times, and it's actually pretty great, but even standard Thunderstone, I think, is underrated. So that is Thunderstone Advance from AEG. However you can play it at this point, that is my number 8. My number 7 is another new game to the list, and actually I just got an expansion for it, and if I had had a chance to play it before I assembled this list, I might have even put it further. But for now, my number 7 is Mystic Vale, also from AEG. Mystic Vale is really It feels like a slight cheat for this list because it is deck building. It's definitely deck building in the sense that you are getting new cards, putting them in your deck, and reshuffling and then playing them. But even as I'm saying that, it really doesn't really explain Mystic Vale really well, because it says right there on the box of Mystic Vale that it's a card crafting system game, I think is the term, the phrase that AEG coined for it. Because what it is, the game comes with sleeves, and you must use sleeves, because you're sliding plastic cards into sleeves with a traditional card back. They're like 7 Wonder size cards. And the card will have an ability on it in either a top, middle, or bottom position, and you can use that ability later on, but also you'll be putting more cards in there with it to fill up those other slots you didn't use. I know that sounds confusing. Please watch my review or someone's review, and preferably mine, and see what I mean, because it's kind of hard to explain. But it's not just that. You're crafting these cards that go into your deck, but also and improving your cards that you've already gotten. But you're also just a push your luck element, because the way you draw cards is you lay them out in a row and hope not to bust by drawing too many cursed lands. The theme is a little bit weak on this one, which is the only downside of the game, really. But otherwise, it's great. It's fast to play. It feels satisfying. There's whole other elements I didn't even talk much about in my review. I was sad to say, like, where you're buying these Vale cards to improve yourself, potentially get points as well. It's just a great, unique, sleek system that I really appreciated, and again, cannot wait to play that expansion. That is Mystic Vale from AEG, my number 7. My number 6 is another new game. I didn't really intend all the new games to be crowded this much together, although it's only 10 on the list, so I guess that was bound to happen. But I bet you thought when I mentioned this game earlier, I mentioned it because it wasn't going to be on the list. Well, I lied, or you thought I lied. My number 6 is Clank from Renegade Game Studios, which was an offshoot of Cryptozoic. Renegade, that's not the name of the game. Clank is a fantastic deck-building game that is one of the most thematic games I've ever, deck-building games especially I've ever played, but even amongst other games, it's very thematic because, again, as I mentioned earlier, you are going down through a dungeon, purchasing cards representing adventurers, tools, spells, all these different things, magic items and relics that are helping you go down into a dungeon in order to steal treasure from a dragon's horde. But it's not going to be that easy, of course, because first off, other adventurers are doing the same thing, and there's only a certain amount of relics, and they're all of different points, and the further you go down, the more expensive they are, so you might want to rush and get those before the other people do and run out of the dungeon with them. But of course, as you go down further and further, there's more and more of a chance of the dragon waking up, and there's a really interesting system of how you produce noise cubes, which go into a bag, and if your cubes get drawn, that represents the dragon attacking you specifically when it wakes up and goes on its rampage, and it just gets angrier and angrier and angrier as time goes on, and eventually it's just going to murder you all, unless you can get out fast enough. And the sooner you can get out, the more points you can get. It's just a fantastic game with lots of things going on, but it doesn't feel too overly complicated. It still feels like a pretty slimmed down game that nevertheless has a lot going on with the deck building and with the moving down to the dungeon. It's just fantastic, and I can't wait to see more expansions for it. That is Clank from Renegade Game Studios, my number 6 deck building game of 2016. For my number 5, I was thinking a lot when I made the list about how I should really pick something that's representative of a particular type of deck building. Stick with me, I'm going somewhere with this. But when you look at games like ones I've already mentioned, like Clank and Thunderstone Advance, those feel so different and unique from each other, even though they might share similar theming, that they kind of are their own thing. But there are deck building games that really just kind of copy each other over and over, and hopefully one of them gets it right for either for a particular person or just in general. To my mind, right now, the best Ascension-style deck building game, Ascension being the first game to do it this way, which is randomized row of cards instead of just the static piles and just buying cards to get points. The best game to do it that way so far is the DC Comics deck building game. It's part of the Cerberus game system from Cryptozoic. Just to clarify, this is my number 5. And there's lots of different games in the Cerberus game engine system. Some of them are even slightly better mechanically, like the Naruto deck building game or the Street Fighter deck building game, than the DC Comics game. But there's so much content, and I like the theme so much better for the DC Comics deck building game, whatever theme there may be, That's another topic of debate. But I like all that stuff so much better that was my choice for my number 5. And it is, I think, the best of this type of deck building that's very random, very swingy, but also very simple to learn. It doesn't take too much time to teach even a new casual gamer, someone who's never played these types of games before at all, to teach them this game. And still, there is skill involved. Still, you need to know what the best cards are, which cards you should be focusing on, getting synergy in your deck. It's much more simplified than other deck building games I've played, and yet in that simplicity, I think, is its strength. And I've played this game far more than I have a lot of the other games on this list because of that, and that has to count for something. And so, sometimes I get a little bit over-defensive about this game, and I don't think it is the best game ever, and obviously it's not even my favorite deck-building game, but I think it should be appreciated for what it is, and I don't really like it when people give it so much hate, because I think they're over-analyzing it just a bit, though you're entitled to your opinion. But nevertheless, it's just buy cards from a row, use them, build up as much power as you can, and what I like about the DC Comics deck building game is that you can get insanely powerful at times, and while that swinginess can be frustrating at times, it can also be very, very empowering. That is the DC Comics deck building game, my favorite of the Cerberus deck building games, my number 5. My number 4, speaking of archetypes within the deck building genre, if there are such things, I think I'm creating that for the first time here and now, Tanto Cuore is my number 4, and I think it is the best example of the Dominion style of deck building games. Now, obviously, many people will just say, well, Dominion is the best example of that because that's the one that started it, and there's still expansions coming out for it today. But for me personally, number 1, I prefer anime-style artwork, and I'm sure I've gotten a ton of shit about that. I'll get more shit about that in the comments right now. Totally fine. Have at it, Haas. But I personally prefer like that kind of style of artwork. Or even if it was anything else other than Dominion style artwork, I'd probably like it better. But even then, if it was just that, I wouldn't like the game as much. Instead, what happens is, with every expansion of Tanto Cuore, I think there's 4 at this point if I remember correctly, there's some new wrinkle thrown into the mix that I find very, very interesting and much better integrated than I've seen in the Dominion expansions. So, in my favorite expansion is this just sounds silly to say, the Romantic Vacation expansion, because it adds another set of cards that you can purchase that are like achievement type cards. If you can discard a certain quantity of cards with certain types, you can get these achievement cards which give you points and special bonuses. I really enjoy that. The last one was the Oktoberfest expansion, which had a beer deck, which I thought was a really interesting addition to the mix. And there's just all these different cool things going on with a theme that I like a lot more. So even though it's not drastically different than Dominion, to me, it's kind of hand in hand as well with the Cerberus engine deck building games, where there's not a tremendous amount of difference between each game, but everyone's got their own favorite within, and for me, that one is Tanto Cuore, but yours might be Dominion. And I like Dominion, and I've had it on the list in the past, I believe, but just not this time. For me, I'm going to say that Tanto Cuore is my best personal example of that genre, or genre within a genre. That is Tanto Cuore, my number 4. My number 3 was actually in almost the exact same position last year. It only fluctuated slightly, and possibly even the year before, and that is Paperback from self-publisher Tim Fowers. Maybe he has a company name by now. I don't know. Paperback is a deck-building game almost in the style of Dominion, where there's static piles of cards, but that's where that in deck building itself is where the comparisons stop, because this is actually like Scrabble meets deck building. You are actually trying to make words with your cards. Each card has either a letter or combination of a couple of letters that you have to string together into the best possible words you can get. The longer the better. Certain bonus cards come into play, and try to score as many points as you can. Now, the points you earn from round to round are actually used to buy better cards out in the allotment of cards you can purchase from the pool of cards, and you can buy, of course, the victory points cards. But it all just comes together so well. It really is a brain-burning game. Games can take a long time, depending on who you're playing with, because everyone wants to do as best as they possibly can. It feels like there's way more pressure in this game to have the best turn possible, because people are judging you for your vocabulary. You're judging you! But I like it, despite that. And there's alternate game modes, cooperative mode, different gameplay things you can add into the mix. It's just a fantastic game. It's one of the best games that if you're trying to get someone initiated into the wider world of more complicated board games and card games, say, oh, you love to play Scrabble? how about this? Say very sinister like that as well, just to really creep them out. But in any case, Paperback, I think there's possibly an expansion coming out. Maybe, I know there's a digital version of it out. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. But no matter how you choose to play it, fantastic game. That is my number 3 deck building game for 2016. My number 2 was last year's number 1, and sadly it only moved down because I just haven't played it very much, which is sad. I would love to play it more. But I've actually got expansions that I have to spend a lot of effort and time to try and paste up with English paste ups, and I haven't been willing to do that, so it's kind of held me back from delving into it too much, which is a terrible excuse. But in any event, you probably want to know what the game is. That is Heart of Crown from... there's so weird Japanese name like Sandals Flip Flops, I think is the name of the original company. However, it is getting an official, finally, English release from Japanime Games. The Kickstarter has already been funded a long time ago. I don't know when it's actually going to come out to the marketplace, but look for it at that point, because no longer do I have to talk about a game that you can't possibly ever get, which is how it's been for quite a while. So Heart of Crown actually mixes different subgenres that we've been talking about this whole time. So you have the static piles of cards that you can purchase, but actually the cards come out randomly like they would in an Ascension style or DC Comics deck building game style. But then they stack up on top of each other, and so there's only, the randomness is cut down quite a bit, and you can hope on more cards of the type that you want coming out very quickly. It's kind of hard to explain. But what's really cool about it is while you're doing these traditional deck building elements, what you're really trying to do is, within this mythical realm and theme of the game, you're trying to nominate a princess, which when you do that, when you say, well, okay, there's these princess cards laid out here, you choose the one that you want to use your cards to purchase, and then she is the start of your realm. And that's where things get really interesting, because when you have a realm, not only do you have the special ability of that princess card you went after, but now you can start stowing away cards from your hand to build your realm, which in any kind of deck building game, you're destroying cards in a sense. This is a way to do that, but to also to make sure they count as points for you, because now they're in your realm and they're safe there. Other genres and other games have things like that, like Tanto Cuore has a way for you to chambermaid your cards and things like that. But it feels very distinct here, especially since you can format your deck in such a way to make that easier to do. You can kind of ignore it to a certain degree. But ultimately what you're trying to do is go after these victory point cards and sort of a race to get to a certain number. I think it's 25 points. It's been a while. But it's such a great game because there's just all these different mishmash of elements going on, but they come together really seamlessly. You really can't see the wires. And it's infinitely expandable because of the fact that you can get the different princess cards and use them together, and just so many different types of cards. There's also, I didn't even talk about a chaining system where you play cards down, and then whether or not you can play more of them, like get more actions, is dependent on how those cards chain together with these little directional arrows on the cards. It's just a fantastic thing. And while it might seem like that's just like this mix and match type of thing, like, again, it just comes together very well. And soon you'll be able to try it for yourself without hunting down an import copy or dismissing me talking about it as the ravings of a lunatic who's way too into Japanese games. But you might still do that last one. That is Heart of Crown, soon to be released from Japanime Games, my number 2, formerly my number 1. So what could my number 1 possibly be? Well, people new to the channel may not have seen this coming, but anyone who's been following my channel for at least a little while probably saw this coming a mile away. My number 1 is Legendary, a Marvel deck building game. Now, I did have to make a decision here. There's lots of different Legendary games, and some of them are the Legendary Encounters games, and those are fantastic, and I don't mix and match them at all. But nevertheless, they still feel very mechanically similar to me. And if you ever ask me, okay, if someone ever came over and said, Nick, I wanted to try one of these Legendary games, which one, and I don't care which one do you prefer to play? I will always go for Legendary, a Marvel deck building game, which is not to take anything away from the Encounters games. But I just love it so much. And I've come to love it more and more and more. If you've been keeping track of my top 10 deck building games list or my top 100 list, it's just been slowly moving up towards the top. And first off, there's so many experiences out right now that the entire Marvel universe of heroes and villains and alternate reality characters and all these different things are in the game or will soon be in the game. And it's Ascension style deck building with the randomized row, and there's 2 randomized rows because villains are coming into the city. You need to use recruit to get heroes. You need to use combat to fight villains. There's a mastermind who you have to fight to win the game, but the mastermind has a scheme. It's super thematic. It's one of the most thematic deck building games I've ever played, which is probably why I've stuck with it for as long as I have. But on top of that, it's just there's so many different combinations of cards, so much so that I had to get a randomizer app because I want to try out as many different possible combinations as I can. And they introduce new mechanisms all the time. It just works together so well. It is long to set up. It's long to take apart. It's not necessarily for everybody. It can be a bit of an acquired taste. I know it's a very polarizing game. But for those of us who are really into it, we are really into it. It's like a whole hobby in and of itself. And it's also fantastic to play solo with the golden solo rules you can find online. I do highly recommend that. People were recommending that to me for a very long time. I finally got around to trying it this past year, and it's fantastic. So do check that out. But in any event, that is Legendary, a Marvel deck building game. And you can wrap up the Encounters games in this category if you want, because those are fantastic as well if you prefer a cooperative and even more thematic experience. But I will always come back to the Marvel version as my number 1. All right, folks, well, I hope you enjoyed that. They're pretty dramatic changes there, but nothing too earth-shattering. The top, 5 were pretty predictable, I would think. But nevertheless, I'm eager to see every year what changes can be made, because deck building is really not going away. It's been out for quite some time now. I think Dominion came out in 2008, 2009, and here we are today still talking about some brand new, fantastic ones coming out. I think it was 3 new entries on the list this year. That's great. But we can't forget our roots. So let's take a look back at last year's list and see what changed and what's gone and so on and so forth. My number 10 last year was Trains, and I saw it coming that this would be off my list. I think it was much higher on the first year's list, but I still like Trains. It's still in my collection. I can't bear to get rid of it because it is so cool, because again, it's taking deck building and adding more to it. A board where you're putting out train tracks, but I don't know. I kind of lost my excitement for it. I don't like the train theme all that much, and as good as the game itself is, I just have so many other better deck building games to play that it's just kind of getting lost in the shuffle. Will it be in my collection forever? I don't know, but it would be in my 11 to 20 at this point for sure. My number 9 last year was Xenoshift. That fell off the list too, and that's just because it's, number 1, I haven't played it that much, but also, when I did play it, I played it a lot, and then I was like, oh, I think I've kind of seen everything this game has to offer. Every game of it I played, whether I played it solo, I played it with 2 players, I played it with 4 players, every game of it felt the same. Which was really a knock against that game. As cool and thematic and neat as it was, where you're like Starship Troopers fighting off alien hordes cooperatively. However, there is a very delayed expansion coming out, standalone expansion called Dreadmire, which, again, cool me or not, in their infinite wisdom, sold a bunch of them at Gen Con and then left everyone else out to dry. I think that's what happened. So we're still waiting on it. And that was months ago. But eventually when that comes out, I'll play it, and maybe it will rekindle my love for the game, and you'll see it on this list again. I don't know. Hopefully they change some things pretty drastically to keep people interested. My number 8 last year was the DC Comics deck building game, so that actually moved up 3 spots. I think it's just, again, I've been playing it a lot. New expansions came out. They're kind of done with expansions at this point, which is fine. There's so much content for it. But it's just a great, simple game to play with anyone. Anyone really who's even slightly nerdy can get behind the whole DC theme, and so it's done well in my group. My number 7, which is off the list, is Ascension. As DC Comics fortunes have grown on my list, Ascensions have plummeted, and it's to the point where I'm just getting rid of Ascension. Because even more so than DC, Ascension can be super swingy. If you don't get the right cards, you're just toast in that game. But at the same time, it's just as random as DC, which is even more frustrating. And it's still got, artwork has gotten way better over time, but the old sets are just completely unusable at this point because of both the artwork and just the clunkiness of the cards. And they keep putting out new sets of Ascension that are, interesting, but they still don't fix the fundamental issues with the game. And again, it's just feeling the same over and over again. So totally not worth it in my opinion, and it's on its way out. My number 6 was High Command, so that's slipping, which makes sense because even though I did get a chance to play it a couple of times, it's not a perfect game, and it's getting crowded out by other things. But I'm still holding on tight to it. Number 5 was Tanto Cuore, which slipped 1 space, which is negligible. That doesn't mean anything necessarily. I've gotten the chance to play that a couple times in the last year with the Oktoberfest expansion. And I'll play it more if they ever put more of it out, including the Moto Tanto Cuore standalone game thing. Number 4 is Paperback, so that moved up 1 spot this year. Again, negligible. Fantastic game then, fantastic game now. Number 3 was Thunderstone Advanced. That dropped significantly. I was really turned off by the fact that they were stopping printing of it and potentially putting out another version. And it's just a very long game, so couldn't hit the table as much as I wanted it to. So I still enjoy it. Still a great game in and of itself, but it is slipping. My number 2 last year, my number 2 and number 1 were my number 1 and number 2 this year. They flipped, which was Legendary and Heart of Crown. Legendary was number 2 last year. Heart of Crown was number 1 last year, and now they flipped. So, again, you can say that's kind of negligible. I still think they're both fantastic, but I would say Legendary is pretty solidly a number 1 right now because of how much I played it, how much I've enjoyed it, how many people I've played with in my group who have also enjoyed it, much more than many of the other games I've talked about today, either from last year's list or this year's list. So, again, that's got to count for something because you're only having as much fun as the people that you play with. But in any case, that was last year's list. I can't wait for next year's list. I can't wait to see more deck building games come out. There may be a time when the deck building games stop and then the list is what the list is, but that time is not yet. So thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned. There'll be more cool top 10 lists and my top 100 list coming out soon. Until then, take care.